At the Cradle of Monsters, we tell stories the human way. Not with artificial voices, not with AI slop. Real storytelling that makes you feel something a machine never could. My name is Rena. Let's begin. Ambassador Cradle of the Velith Diplomatic Corps had, in his 31 years of interstellar service, been assigned to 14 different species across 9 star systems. He had negotiated trade agreements with the Sorn, whose concept of value was entirely communal, and who experienced individual ownership as a mild psychological disorder. He had facilitated first contact with the Dren, who communicated exclusively through the precise arrangement of colored stones, and who had, on his first visit, spent 6 hours telling him something that turned out to be a grocery list. He had survived the Karath verification process, which involved 3 days of what the Karath called establishing baseline sincerity, and which involved no sleep and a great deal of very direct eye contact. He had received the Chicago assignment on a Tuesday. He had read the briefing document 3 times. He had then gone to his supervisor, Senior Coordinator Pell, and stood in her office doorway and said, with the specific flatness of a career diplomat who had learned that emotion was rarely productive, "I want to register a formal objection." Pell had looked up from her desk. "Your objection is noted. I would like it noted more substantially than that." "Cradle," she said, "you are the most experienced field diplomat in the Corps. You have successfully navigated 14 first and second contact situations. You speak 11 languages and functional versions of 4 others." She paused. "You are the only person I have who can do this." "With respect," Cradle said, "that assessment may be based on insufficient understanding of what Chicago actually is. I've read the same briefing document you have. Then you understand why I am standing in your doorway." Pell looked at him for a moment. "The humans have formally requested a diplomatic visit. We have agreed. The purpose of the visit is to establish the framework for a trade and cultural exchange agreement. You will spend 1 standard day in the city of Chicago, accompanied by a human diplomatic liaison, and you will produce a preliminary assessment of their readiness for formal inclusion in the Velith diplomatic network." She picked up her stylus. "It is 1 day, Cradle." The briefing document, Cradle said carefully, describes Chicago as home to 2.7 million humans. Yes, all of them present, simultaneously, in one city. That is generally how cities work. "Pell," he said, "I have read the supplementary cultural materials. I have reviewed 40 hours of human documentary footage. I have studied their communication patterns, their social structures, their transportation systems, their dietary habits, and their recreational customs." He paused. "I have a number of concerns." "Which ones specifically?" Cradle thought about the 40 hours of documentary footage. He thought about the specific segment he had watched 4 times because he was certain he was misunderstanding it, which showed several hundred humans voluntarily entering a small metal container and being propelled underground at high speed while standing pressed against each other without apparent distress. He thought about the segment showing a human event called a stadium concert, in which approximately 60,000 humans gathered in an outdoor space and made, in unison, a sound that the documentary described as cheering, and which had caused his sound sensitivity membranes to retract involuntarily at 50% volume. "All of them," he said. The Velith Diplomatic Corps' preparation process for a Chicago assignment was, by any measure, thorough. Cradle received 12 additional briefing documents. He attended 7 preparatory sessions with the Corps' human cultural specialists, who were 4 Velith researchers who had spent between 2 and 8 years studying humanity from a comfortable distance through digital media, and who had never, as far as Cradle could determine, actually met a human in person. He reviewed the complete diplomatic protocol that the Corps and the Human State Department had negotiated over the preceding 8 months, which covered everything from appropriate greeting gestures to acceptable conversation topics, to the specific list of human foods that had been cleared as non-toxic for Velith consumption, which was a shorter list than Cradle would have preferred. He also, independently and without official sanction, requested access to the Corps' psychological resilience training module, which was designed for diplomats being assigned to high-stress environments. The training coordinator had looked at his request form, looked at his assignment details, and approved it without comment. This did not make Cradle feel better. His diplomatic liaison, he was informed, would be a human named Dr. Patricia Chen, Senior Diplomatic Attaché for the United States State Department, with 20 years of experience in interstellar diplomatic coordination. Her file described her as exceptionally capable, highly adaptable, and known for her calm under unusual circumstances. This last point, Cradle noted, was the kind of qualification that only appeared in files when the circumstances in question had been tested. He arrived at O'Hare International Airport on a Wednesday morning, in what the humans called September, which was apparently a pleasant time of year by their atmospheric standards, which meant it was approximately 22 degrees Celsius, which was 11 degrees warmer than Cradle found comfortable, and the air was rich in oxygen and nitrogen, and a variety of other compounds that his environmental suit filtered appropriately, but that he could feel against his sensory membranes as a kind of pressing aliveness that had no equivalent in any environment he had previously worked in. He stood at the arrivals gate and took 3 measured breaths and reminded himself that he was a 31-year veteran of the Velith Diplomatic Corps and had survived the Karath verification process and had, on one occasion, negotiated a trade agreement while a species called the Marith conducted their traditional territorial display ceremony 8 meters away, which involved bioluminescent threat patterns and a sound frequency that affected the Velith inner ear in a way that was technically non-damaging and practically indistinguishable from distress. He could handle Chicago. Dr. Patricia Chen was waiting on the other side of the arrivals gate. She was a human female of middle age, which Cradle had learned was a relative descriptor given that humans lived between 70 and 90 standard years, with dark hair cut efficiently short, and an expression of professional warmth that he recognized as the expression of someone who was experienced enough to make warmth look natural without it necessarily being their baseline state. She wore a dark suit. She carried a data tablet. She walked toward him with her right hand extended, which he recognized from his briefing as the human greeting gesture called a handshake, and he extended his right appendage in response, which she grasped and moved in the brief vertical motion the briefing had described. "Ambassador Cradle," she said. "Welcome to Chicago. I'm Dr. Chen. How was your journey?" "Uneventful," he said. "Thank you for the question." She smiled. It was a good smile. The briefing had prepared him for the fact that humans showed their teeth when expressing positive emotion, which was the reverse of what the smile reflex meant in 4 of the 14 species he had previously worked with, and he had practiced his response to it enough times that he no longer experienced the brief threat assessment instinct that had characterized his first exposure. "I have your schedule for today," she said, producing the data tablet. "We've planned a comprehensive overview of Chicago's cultural, commercial, and civic infrastructure, with time built in for meals and rest periods. We want you to get a genuine sense of the city." Cradle looked at the schedule. Then he looked at it again. "Dr. Chen," he said, "this schedule includes something called the L train. Chicago's elevated rail system, yes, it's the best way to move through the city. Gives you a real ground-level view of how the city functions." "I see." He looked at the schedule. "It also includes something called the Chicago Riverwalk. A pedestrian promenade along the Chicago River, lovely this time of year. And a farmer's market. The Green City Market, one of the city's best. Very vibrant." Cradle looked at her. "Dr. Chen, when you use the word vibrant." "Yes? Are you using it to mean visually interesting? Or are you using it as a euphemism for loud and densely populated?" Something moved in her expression. Not the professional warmth. Something underneath it. Something that was, he would come to understand over the course of the day, the specific expression of a human who was working to keep their face exactly where it was. "A little of both," she said. "I think you'll find it manageable." "You think," he said. "I know you'll find it manageable," she said. "Shall we begin?" The Chicago Transit Authority's elevated rail system, known colloquially as the L, had been in operation since 1892, which was, Cradle reflected, longer than the Velith had been aware that humans existed. It ran on tracks elevated above street level through the city's core and underground, through its outer neighborhoods carrying approximately 800,000 passengers per day in cars that were, by the specifications in his briefing document, designed for a maximum capacity of approximately 180 persons per car. The car they boarded contained, by Cradle's count, significantly more than 180 persons. He stood, because there were no seats, holding a metal bar that many other humans were also holding, pressed on three sides by humans who were pressed by other humans, in a space that was warm and loud and smelled of the specific combination of human biological processes and environmental compounds that he had been briefed about, and which the briefing had described as characteristic, and which he was now experiencing directly as something for which characteristic was a word doing a great deal of work. Dr. Chen stood beside him. She had one hand on the same metal bar and her data tablet in the other, and she appeared, as far as Cradle could determine, entirely unaffected by the situation. "This is the red line," she said, in the raised voice required by the ambient noise level. "We'll take it to the loop, that's the downtown core, and then transfer to the blue line for the near north side." "I understand," Cradle said. He was focusing on maintaining his proprioceptive stability, which was the polite diplomatic term for not falling over when the train moved, because the train's motion was not the smooth, predictable motion of the transit systems he was accustomed to, but something more characterized by what he would later describe in his report as enthusiastic directional variation. The human to his left was listening to audio through small devices inserted in his ears, and moving his head in a rhythmic pattern that Cradle's briefing had identified as a behavior called nodding to music, and which was apparently involuntary and non-communicative. The human to his right was looking at a small handheld screen and laughing at something on it without making any sound, which was a combination of behaviors that Cradle found difficult to parse. The human directly in front of him was eating a food item that the briefing had not covered, and that smelled of spices that his environmental filters registered as non-toxic but intense. "Dr. Chen," Cradle said. "Yes? Is it always like this?" She considered the question. "Rush hour is busier," she said. Cradle absorbed this information. "This is not rush hour," he said. "It is 10:30 a.m. on a Wednesday," she said. "Rush hour is 7 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 6 p.m. He looked at the car, at the 180-plus humans, at the eating and the music nodding and the soundless laughing and the three separate conversations happening at volumes that suggested the participants had not noticed they were in a small enclosed space with other people. "Dr. Chen," he said, "I have a question. Of course, in your experience working with interstellar diplomatic visitors, has anyone ever, on the L train, has anyone ever what? Needed to stop," he said carefully, "and compose themselves." She looked at him with the professional warmth and the thing underneath it. "We have a stop in 4 minutes. There's a platform, fresh air if you need a moment." "I do not need a moment," he said. The train made a turn that could, in Cradle's assessment, only be described as aggressive. "I may need a moment," he said. They stood on the platform at Fullerton Station for 6 minutes. The air was better. The sound level was significantly reduced. 2 pigeons walked across the platform in the specific manner of animals that had coexisted with humans long enough to have absorbed some of their confidence, which was to say they walked as though the platform was theirs and Cradle was the guest. He watched them. "What are those?" he asked. "Pigeons," Dr. Chen said. "Urban birds, very common in Chicago. They are not alarmed by me." "Pigeons are not alarmed by much," she said. "They have determined over several centuries of urban coexistence that humans are mostly harmless and occasionally provide food. I think they've extended that assessment to include most beings of roughly human scale." Cradle watched a pigeon walk directly under a bench, extract a piece of something from the ground, and eat it with complete composure. "In my species," he said, "the ability to remain calm in the presence of an unknown entity is considered a significant cognitive achievement. It is tested for in our diplomatic candidates. In Chicago," Dr. Chen said, "it appears to develop naturally in birds." He looked at her. The professional warmth was fully present, but underneath it, he was increasingly certain, was something else. Something that was working quite hard at being underneath the professional warmth. "Dr. Chen," he said, "are you enjoying this?" "I am doing my job, Ambassador," she said. "That is not what I asked." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said with great precision, "I think Chicago is a remarkable city and I am glad to share it with you." It was, he noted, a perfect diplomatic answer. He had given many of them himself. He filed it away. The Green City Market occupied a portion of Lincoln Park on the city's north side and contained, by Cradle's count, approximately 300 humans at various stages of selecting, discussing, consuming, and exchanging opinions about food. The food itself came in quantities and varieties that his briefing had not fully prepared him for. There were vegetables of sizes that seemed implausible until he remembered that Earth's gravity and atmospheric conditions produced biological growth patterns that were simply different from the Velith home systems. There were prepared foods of every description, some of which were being consumed on the spot by humans who appeared to require no particular occasion to eat, which was a behavioral pattern the briefing had noted and which he was now observing at scale. There were 2 children running between stalls in a pattern that suggested either pursuit or joy or both, and a dog. He recognized the species from the documentary footage, attached to a human by a cord, and investigating every object within cord range with a systematic thoroughness that Cradle, as a researcher by training, found professionally admirable. "This way," Dr. Chen said, guiding him toward a stall selling something that smelled of apples which were on his cleared list. They moved through the market. Cradle received a number of looks from the humans present, which was expected. He was by any measure visually distinctive in this environment, and the looks were of a variety he had learned to categorize: interest, surprise, the rapid return to studied non-reaction that appeared to be considered polite in Chicago, and in 2 cases what he had come to identify as the specifically human expression of wanting very much to approach and speak to him, but being uncertain of the protocol. One of the 2 approached. She was perhaps 70 years old, with white hair and the deliberate movement of someone whose body required more attention to navigate than it once had, and she walked up to him with the specific confidence of a person who had decided that uncertainty of protocol was not going to stop her. "Excuse me," she said, "are you an alien?" Cradle looked at Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen's expression communicated with impressive economy that this was not something she had arranged, but also not something she was going to rescue him from. "I am a representative of the Velith Diplomatic Corps," he said. "Yes," the woman considered this. "Are you enjoying Chicago?" "I am forming a comprehensive assessment of the city," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked," she said. Cradle paused. It was, he noted, exactly what he had said to Dr. Chen on the platform at Fullerton Station. "I am finding it," he said with great precision, "stimulating." The woman smiled. It was a different kind of smile than Dr. Chen's professional warmth. It was the smile of someone who has been alive long enough that they have stopped maintaining the surface and are operating entirely from the interior. "Stimulating," she repeated. "That's diplomatic." "I am a diplomat," he said. "Do you want a sample of this apple cake? It's very good. My daughter made it." She gestured at the stall. "She's been nervous all morning because she heard there might be an alien at the market today." Cradle looked at the stall. A human female of middle age was watching him with an expression of extreme concentration that he identified as the expression of someone who was trying to appear as though they were not watching him. He looked at Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen's expression remained perfectly professionally neutral. He looked at the apple cake. Apples were on his cleared list. "I would be honored," he said. The apple cake was, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinary. The Velith dietary experience was comprehensive and included foods from 11 different planetary systems, and Cradle had eaten things that required specialized metabolic preparation and things that had textures for which his species had no prior reference. He had eaten well across 31 years of field experience, and he had opinions about food that were more developed than his professional material suggested. The apple cake was better than most of what he had eaten in 31 years of field experience. He said so. The woman's daughter, whose name was Maria, which she told him while turning the color that humans turned when they were experiencing what the briefing called embarrassment, appeared to experience this information as something close to overwhelming. She offered him a second piece. He accepted. He stood at the market stall for 20 minutes eating apple cake and answering questions from Maria and her mother, whose name was Dolores, about the Velith home system, and what he found most surprising about Earth, and whether the Velith had anything like cake, which they did not, and whether he thought they should develop something like cake, which he did. Other humans gathered. Not intrusively, they maintained a distance that suggested social awareness of the situation, but they gathered, and some of them asked questions, and the questions were not the careful, briefing document questions that diplomatic preparatory materials had suggested he would receive. They were the questions of people who were genuinely curious about what he ate for breakfast, about whether his species dreamed, about whether Chicago seemed big to him or small, about what his favorite thing had been so far. He said the pigeons. Several humans laughed. He was not certain if this was the response he had intended, or a different response that happened to align with his statement, but it was warm laughter, the kind that included rather than excluded, and he found that he did not mind it. Dr. Chen stood slightly apart from the group, her data tablet at her side, watching. Her expression, he noticed, had shifted. The professional warmth was still present. The thing underneath it was more visible than it had been. What he could see of it, now that he was looking, was something he identified, with some surprise, as satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of a task proceeding correctly. Something warmer than that. He filed it away again. The Chicago Riverwalk ran along the south bank of the Chicago River through the downtown core, a pedestrian promenade of restaurants and vendor stalls and open seating areas, and at every accessible point along its length, humans. Humans eating, humans walking, humans sitting with their feet hanging over the edge toward the water. Humans taking photographs of the buildings, which were tall and dense and cast the Riverwalk into a combination of shadow and light that was, Cradle had to acknowledge, visually remarkable. Humans taking photographs of each other. 3 humans taking photographs of him. At a distance they appeared to believe was unobtrusive, which it was not, but which he had decided to receive as interest rather than intrusion. The river itself was, according to the briefing document, a significant civic and engineering achievement. It had been reversed in 1900. The humans had, for reasons of public health, physically redirected the flow of a river, which was the kind of information that sounded implausible, and then became, the more he thought about it, entirely consistent with everything else he had learned about them. They reversed the river, he said to Dr. Chen. They did, she said, because it was flowing in the wrong direction. Because it was carrying waste toward Lake Michigan, which was the city's water supply, so they reversed it. He looked at the river. How long did that take? The project took about 2 years, but they'd been talking about it for decades. In Velith engineering, Cradle said, when a river flows in an inconvenient direction, the standard approach is to route infrastructure around it. That's very sensible, Dr. Chen said. You reversed the river, he said. We thought it was simpler, she said. He looked at her. Dr. Chen, he said, I have been a diplomat for 31 years. I have encountered species with biological hive minds, species that experienced time non-linearly, species that had evolved from aquatic predators and retained the instincts. I want to be honest with you about something. Please, she said. Your species is the most difficult to predict of any I have encountered. She considered this. Difficult to predict how. Every other species I have worked with has an internal logic that, once understood, makes their behavior comprehensible. The Soren's communal value system is disorienting at first, but follows consistent rules once the framework is clear. The Karath's precision is demanding, but it is precision. It does not surprise you once you understand that it will always be precise. He looked at the river. Your species does not appear to operate from a single framework. You reverse rivers. You build cities containing 2.7 million individuals and then travel through them pressed against each other in metal containers underground. You feed apple cake to diplomatic visitors at farmers' markets because a grandmother was not going to let uncertainty of protocol stop her. He paused. And then you laugh about it. And the laughter is warm. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. They were standing at the river's edge, the water moving below them in its reverse direction, the buildings overhead, the humans on all sides. "Ambassador," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you say difficult to predict, is that a problem for your assessment?" He thought about it. In diplomatic terms, predictability is considered an asset. A predictable partner is a reliable partner. And unpredictable? Unpredictable can mean unreliable, he said. Or it can mean, he stopped. Or it can mean what? He looked at the reversed river. It can mean that the framework is larger than you initially mapped, that the logic exists, but that it is more complex than a single organizing principle can capture. He paused. It can mean that what appeared to be chaos is actually a system operating at a level of simultaneity that is difficult to observe from outside it. Dr. Chen looked at him. "Ambassador Cradle," she said. "That may be the most accurate description of Chicago that anyone has ever offered." They stood at the river for a while. A pigeon landed nearby, investigated the area with professional thoroughness, and departed. The incident, which is what the human documentation called it, in the same flat tone that the documentation used for everything, which Cradle had come to understand, was a specifically human approach to events that would, in any other diplomatic context, be described differently. Occurred at 3:47 p.m. on the Riverwalk. It began with a sound. The sound came from the direction of a restaurant approximately 40 meters along the promenade, and it was, his sound sensitivity membranes registered before his conscious processing caught up, significant. Not the ambient sound of the city, which he had been managing throughout the day. Something different in pitch and volume and, most importantly, in the quality of surprise it communicated from the humans around him, because the humans on the Riverwalk, who had been maintaining the studied non-reaction that Chicago appeared to cultivate as a civic virtue, all turned in the same direction at the same moment. Cradle turned with them. A human male was standing outside the restaurant holding what appeared to be a very large quantity of food, which he had clearly been carrying and had clearly just dropped, and which was now distributed across the Riverwalk in a radius that suggested significant velocity at the moment of impact. The human was looking at the food. The food was looking at the Riverwalk. Several other humans had stopped to observe the situation. Then a second thing happened. A dog, not the dog from the farmer's market, a different dog, a very large one with the specific expression of an animal that has just identified an opportunity, pulled free of the cord attaching it to a human female, covered the distance to the fallen food in approximately 1.3 seconds, and began to eat with a thoroughness and enthusiasm that suggested it had been planning for exactly this moment. The human female attempted to retrieve the cord. The dog, without looking up from the food, moved in a direction that kept the food accessible and the cord slightly out of reach, which was either coincidence or strategy, and Cradle, having studied documentary footage of dogs, was not certain it was coincidence. A third thing happened. A child, approximately 5 years old by human developmental staging, Cradle estimated, who had been on the Riverwalk with what he assumed were their parents, saw the dog eating the fallen food and began to run toward it with the specific purposeful gait of a 5-year-old who has identified something interesting and has not yet fully incorporated the concept of obstacles into their planning. The child's parent, realizing the trajectory, began to move after them. The child reached the dog. The dog looked up from the food, assessed the child, determined the child was not a food competitor, and returned to eating. The child sat down next to the dog and began to watch the eating with an expression of complete fascination. The parent arrived. The parent looked at the child sitting next to the dog sitting next to the fallen food. The parent looked at the human male who had dropped the food. The human male looked at the parent. The dog looked at neither of them because the food required attention. 3 strangers and a dog and a child regarded each other in the middle of the Chicago Riverwalk. Then the human male said something. Then the parent said something. Then the other human female, the one whose dog it was, arrived and said something. Then all three of them laughed. Cradle stood and watched this. He had been briefed on human laughter. He had studied it in the documentary footage. He understood its function as a social bonding mechanism, its role in diffusing tension, its use as a signal of group cohesion following a shared experience of incongruity. He understood it. He watched the three strangers and the dog and the child and the fallen food and the laughter, and he understood all of it, and he also felt something that his 31 years of diplomatic training had equipped him to identify, and his 31 years of diplomatic training had not equipped him to do much about. He felt that he wished very much to laugh too. He did not. He was a diplomat. He maintained his professional composure. He turned back to Dr. Chen, who had witnessed the entire sequence of events from beside him. "Dr. Chen," he said. "Yes, Ambassador? I have a question." "Of course." "The three humans," he said. "They did not know each other before this." "Almost certainly not," she said. "And now they are laughing together." "Yes. Because a dog ate some food. Because an unexpected thing happened," she said. "And they were all there for it, and that made them briefly the same kind of people. The kind who were there when the dog ate the food on the Riverwalk in September. And that was enough." He looked at the three strangers who were now exchanging something. Small cards he identified from his briefing, contact information. The child was still sitting next to the dog. The dog had finished the food and was now investigating the child's shoes. "On the Velith homeworld," Cradle said, "social bonds between strangers require a minimum of 3 formal interactions with established context before casual communication is considered appropriate." "That does seem efficient," Dr. Chen said. "It takes approximately a year to make a friend from a standing start," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take those 3? He looked at them. The laughter was subsiding into conversation. The child's parent was now holding the child, who had apparently decided that the dog's shoes investigation was sufficient acquaintance to attempt climbing. The dog was tolerating this with the expression of an animal that had decided today was a day for tolerance. 4 minutes, he said. "About right," she said. He stood there for a long moment. Then, because he had been a diplomat for 31 years and had learned that the moments when you felt something unexpected were the moments worth examining, he said, "Dr. Chen, I want to ask you something directly." "All right," she said. "This day," he said, "the L train, the farmer's market, Dolores and Maria, the pigeons, the reversed river, this." He gestured at the Riverwalk, at the 3 strangers and the dog and the child. "Was this planned?" Dr. Chen looked at him with the professional warmth and the thing underneath it. "The schedule was planned," she said. "The L train and the Riverwalk and the market are all standard elements of a Chicago diplomatic orientation itinerary." "That is not what I asked," he said. She held his gaze. "Ambassador Cradle," she said, "you are asking whether the purpose of today was what the briefing document described." "Yes," he said. "That is what I am asking." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The purpose of today was exactly what the briefing document described. A comprehensive overview of Chicago's cultural, commercial, and civic infrastructure. A genuine sense of the city." She paused. The briefing document just didn't specify what a genuine sense of Chicago actually involves. He looked at her. "Which is," he said slowly. "Which is this," she said. "All of this. Not a presentation of it. Not a managed version of it. Chicago as it actually is on a Wednesday in September when a grandmother offers apple cake and a dog eats someone's lunch and 3 strangers make friends in 4 minutes." She met his gaze directly. "We could have taken you to a conference room. We could have shown you presentations. We could have given you curated demonstrations of human cultural achievement in controlled settings." She paused. "We didn't." Cradle was quiet for a long time. The city moved around him. The river ran backwards below him. The 3 strangers had exchanged their small cards and were parting, still laughing about something, the dog now walking beside its owner with the satisfied gait of an animal that had accomplished its goals for the afternoon. "You put me in the city," he said. "Yes," she said. "Because you believed that the city would make the argument for you." She was quiet. "Dr. Chen," he said, "the preliminary assessment I am required to produce, the readiness for formal inclusion in the Velith diplomatic network." He paused. "You were not uncertain about what that assessment would say." "We were not," she said. "No. You were not uncertain because you knew that one day in Chicago would produce a specific kind of information, the kind that briefing documents and curated presentations cannot produce." He looked at the river. "You knew that the point was not to impress me." "No," she said. "The point was to introduce you." He stood with that for a long time. The city was making its sounds around him. The ambient roar of it, which he had found overwhelming on the L train, had become, over the course of the day, something that he was processing differently. Not as assault, as information, as the specific sound of 2.7 million people all doing their thing simultaneously in the same place, each one individual, each one a Dolores or a Maria or a man who dropped his lunch or a child who sat down next to a dog, each one operating from the same basic framework. The framework that turned strangers into 4-minute friends and reversed rivers when they were inconvenient and fed apple cake to alien diplomats at farmers' markets, because a grandmother was not going to let uncertainty of protocol stop her. He thought about what he had told Dr. Chen on the Riverwalk. That the logic existed, but that it was more complex than a single organizing principle could capture. That what appeared to be chaos was actually a system operating at a level of simultaneity that was difficult to observe from outside it. He thought about what that meant for his assessment. "Dr. Chen," he said. "Yes, Ambassador?" "This was not the worst day I have had in 31 years of diplomatic service," he said. Something in her expression shifted. "No," she said. "It was," he said carefully, "the most comprehensively disorienting. It was the most simultaneously overwhelming and unexpectedly pleasant. It was the day in which my existing frameworks were most thoroughly insufficient to process what I was experiencing." He paused. "It was the day in which I most frequently felt that my training had not prepared me adequately, which is to say, it was the day in which I most frequently encountered something I had not encountered before." Dr. Chen looked at him. "And for a diplomat," she said, "is that good or bad?" "For a diplomat," he said, "who has been doing this for 31 years and who has developed very good frameworks for understanding species he has not previously encountered, and who was beginning to wonder if perhaps the frameworks had become a substitute for actual encounter." He paused. The river moved backward below them. "It was necessary," he said. The preliminary assessment that Ambassador Cradle submitted to the Velith Diplomatic Corps Senior Council was 47 pages long, which was 14 pages longer than the standard format allowed for, and which his supervisor, Pell, had read in one sitting, and then called him directly, which was unusual. "Cradle," she said. "Coordinator Pell. This report." "Yes." "Section 7, she said. The section titled, "On the Inadvisability of Attempting to Develop a Comprehensive Predictive Framework for Human Behavior Before Witnessing It Directly." "I stand by that section," he said. "It's 11 pages." The subject required 11 pages. A pause. "You recommend immediate inclusion in the diplomatic network." "I do." "You also recommend—" He heard her pause, the specific pause of someone finding a specific passage. "You recommend that all Velith diplomatic staff assigned to human contact zones undergo what you call unstructured direct exposure to human urban environments before receiving their formal assignments." "Correct." "You are recommending that we send our diplomats to spend a day in a human city with no controlled elements." "I am recommending that we send our diplomats to spend a day in a human city with the elements that are actually present," he said, "which are not controlled." "Yes." Another pause. "Cradle," she said, "the L train section." He waited. "You described the experience as—" She paused again. "Proprioceptively challenging and socially dense in a way that the phrase socially dense does not adequately capture, but that produced, by the end of the experience, a functional recalibration of my baseline assumptions about acceptable proximity to beings I did not yet know." She paused. "You found being pressed against strangers on a train useful." I found being pressed against strangers on a train recalibrating, he said. There is a difference. Is there? Before the L train, he said, I was experiencing Chicago as something to be managed. After the L train, I was experiencing it as something to be observed. He paused. The distinction is significant. Pell was quiet for a moment. The grandmother, she said. Dolores. Yes. You quote her in the report. I do. You quote a human grandmother from a farmer's market in the section on diplomatic methodology. Her observation was relevant, Cradle said. Pell read. That's diplomatic, said in response to the word stimulating. She paused. You are using a human grandmother's casual observation as an anchor point for a section on the limitations of diplomatic language. She identified a limitation of diplomatic language in 3 words, Cradle said. That seemed worth noting. Another long pause. Cradle, Pell said. The recommendation in section 12, the one about Dr. Chen. Yes. You recommend that she be designated primary liaison for all future Velith human diplomatic exchanges. I do. On what basis? He thought about the platform at Fullerton Station. He thought about the professional warmth and the thing underneath it. He thought about her saying, the point was to introduce you, with the directness of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say the true thing and had judged that the moment had arrived. On the basis, he said, that she understands the difference between managing an encounter and facilitating one, and that she knew which one this needed to be. Pell was quiet for a long time. The dog, she said finally. You include the dog. The dog is significant. You include a dog eating someone's lunch as a significant diplomatic observation. Not the eating, he said. What happened after the eating, the 3 strangers, the 4 minutes. He paused. Section 9 covers this. The part about what humans consider sufficient grounds for social bond formation. I read Section 9, Pell said, 3 times. And? A pause. And I am going to approve your report, she said, with one request. Which is? When we send the next diplomatic candidate to Chicago, she said, I want you to brief them personally, not from the standard materials. She paused. Brief them from what you actually know. Cradle thought about the day, about the L train and the apple cake and the reversed river and the 3 strangers and the dog and the grandmother, who was not going to let uncertainty of protocol stop her and Dr. Chen saying the point was to introduce you. I will need approximately 47 pages, he said. Pell laughed. It was, he noted, the warm kind. The formal inclusion ceremony for humanity in the Velith diplomatic network was held, at humanity's request, in Chicago. Specifically, on the Riverwalk. Specifically, on a Wednesday in March, which was not September, and was therefore colder than the briefing document had suggested Cradle might find comfortable, but which was, Dr. Chen had assured him, entirely representative of Chicago in March, and he had accepted this on the grounds that the day was not about his comfort. 43 Velith diplomatic representatives attended. 12 of them had completed the unstructured direct exposure protocol that Cradle had recommended. 1 day in a human city, no controlled elements, just the city as it actually was. Their reports, which he had read, varied in tone and length but shared one consistent observation, which was that they had not been prepared and that this had, ultimately, been the point. The ceremony was brief by diplomatic standards. There were speeches. There were formal document signings. There was a moment in which the Velith High Coordinator and the Human Secretary General stood on the Riverwalk in the March cold and exchanged the formal words that made official what the day in September had already established. After the ceremony, Cradle stood at the river's edge with Dr. Chen. March, he said. I know, she said. I did warn you. You said, somewhat cooler, he said. Which is, I now understand, the human equivalent of, prepare yourself, she smiled. The professional warmth was present. The thing underneath it was more present than it had been in September, or perhaps he was simply better at reading it. Ambassador, she said, Section 9 of your report. Yes? You wrote that humans consider shared experience of incongruity sufficient grounds for social bond formation. That being present for the same unexpected thing creates, briefly, the same kind of people. Yes, he said. We have now shared, she said, a train, a farmer's market, a river walk, a dog, a grandmother, a reversed river, 47 pages, 6 months of diplomatic preparation, and a March ceremony in the cold. She paused. By your own framework. He looked at the river. Dr. Chen, he said, I submitted the report 6 months ago, the report in which I recommended you as primary liaison. I know, she said. Before submitting it, he said, I reviewed it for accuracy. I reviewed every section, including section 12. The recommendation section. Yes. He paused. I want to be transparent about something. Please, she said. The recommendation that you be designated primary liaison, he said. I stated it was based on your understanding of the difference between managing an encounter and facilitating one. Yes, she said. That was accurate, he said. It was also incomplete. She was quiet. The complete basis, he said, includes the platform at Fullerton Station, and the moment when you said the point was to introduce you, and the specific quality of the thing underneath the professional warmth that I spent the entire day trying to identify correctly. He paused, which I eventually identified as the satisfaction of someone who had planned something that worked. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. The river moved below them. Ambassador Cradle, she said. Yes. I want to be transparent about something too. Please. The day in September, she said. The L train and the farmer's market and the river walk, the schedule. Yes. Dolores comes to the Green City Market every Wednesday, she said. She has been coming for 11 years. She always offers samples. She offered them to the last 3 diplomatic visitors we brought to the market, and in each case the visitor declined, and in each case the encounter was brief and correct and professionally appropriate. She paused. I did not tell her you were coming. I did not ask her to approach you. I simply brought you to a place where I knew she would be. Cradle was quiet. And the dog, he said. I cannot account for the dog, she said. The dog was genuinely unplanned. And the 3 strangers. Also unplanned, she said. But I chose the river walk at that time of day because I knew what the river walk at that time of day was like. She paused. I knew what Chicago does when you put someone in it who is paying attention. He stood with that. Dr. Chen, he said, you did not manage the encounter. No, she said. You managed the conditions under which the encounter was possible, he said, and then you let the city do the rest. Yeah, she said. That is, he said slowly, a more sophisticated diplomatic methodology than anything in the Velith Corps' standard training materials. It's not mine, she said. It's Chicago's. I just know how to use it. He looked at the river, at the city above it, at the buildings and the humans on all sides, each one doing their thing, each one part of the system that operated at a level of simultaneity that was difficult to observe from outside it. He had been inside it for 1 day in September and 1 day in March. He thought he might need several more days. Dr. Chen, he said. Yes, Ambassador. I will be filing a supplementary report, he said, on the methodology of using environmental conditions to facilitate diplomatic encounters. Approximately 30 pages. She smiled. The professional warmth and the thing underneath it were, by this point, indistinguishable from each other. I'll look forward to reading it, she said. A pigeon landed nearby. It walked across the river walk with complete confidence. It investigated the area. It found nothing of interest. It left. The pigeons have not changed, Cradle observed. No, Dr. Chen said. They rarely do. I find that, he said, oddly reassuring. Most people do, she said. The river moved below them backward, the way a reversed river moves, which is to say, purposefully, in the direction someone decided it should go, because it needed to, because that was what the situation required, and because once you have decided to reverse a river, you do not do it halfway. Cradle stood at the edge of it, and thought about what 31 years of diplomacy had and had not prepared him for. He thought, not this. He thought that was the point.